Jonathan, journalist and historian, is a product of Chicago, with parents and three siblings dedicated to progressive politics and civic service. Jonathan's home was a hub of activity with public meetings, envelope stuffing, and petitions. Jonathan, his two sisters, and brother absorbed politics and policies with their pablum. They still sustain civic reform in their daily lives. Former editor of Newsweek magazine, radio and TV commentator, documentary film producer, Jonathan is a presidential analyst with three prize-winning books, one studying the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and two on President Obama. He has interviewed Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter as president, and at least a dozen times for this book. Clinton, including the first interview with Clinton after his leaving the presidency, George H.W. Bush, and Barack Obama. He has also written extensively on education, racism, fiscal policy, terrorism, anti-Semitism, you name it, national service, and more, including his own role in surviving, and thank goodness, a cancerous brain tumor. This authoritative biography, his very best, Jimmy Carter: A Life, is the story of a smart, shy boy growing up on a dirt farm with no electricity in the Jim Crow South to the 96-year-old president teaching Sunday school every Sunday in his hometown, Plains, Georgia, drawing tourists who sleep in the parking lot for a coveted seat in the class. I am fortunate to have lived through most of these years, but am deeply moved by this page-turning drama, and it really is a page-turner, on the power of determination, personality, family, and devotion, on the long life of one man and the history of our nation. Tell us more, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and I'm really honored that you would think to have me today. I wanted to just give you a little bit more about my biography because it relates to the Stevensons. First of all, in the interest of accuracy and to suggest to you that I'm a real fierce defender of accuracy and become obsessed with it when it comes to my own work, I need to just mention that I actually didn't have a brain tumor. I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I just wanted to clarify that. But that was 15 years ago. And also I wasn't the editor-in-chief. I was a senior editor at Newsweek. But having said that, I'm really, really grateful for that generous introduction. I have known you and the man I still call Senator Stevenson. I can't bring myself to call him Adlai. Since as early as I can remember. My parents, my late parents, Jim and Joanne Alter, worked in both the 1952 and 1956 presidential campaigns, and I believe knew you from that period. And then in 1975, I was an intern in the Senate office in Washington. A year later, when I went back to stay with another Stevenson intern, our softball team was called Ads Libs, and we would play Percy's Cushions in softball. So I was back to kind of play softball and hang out, and he was staying at your house on Foxhall Road in Washington, and I remember seeing a book opened to the vice presidency, because at that time, Jimmy Carter was considering Adlai Stevenson to be his vice president. He made the short list of 6 finalists. And as I think people know, Carter ended up choosing Walter Mondale, your good friends. Walter Mondale and his wife, Joan, made a major contribution when he was vice president. And in fact, Jimmy Carter revolutionized the vice presidency. He was the first one to give the vice president any authority, the first president to do so. So if Adlai had gotten the nod at that point, it would have been a very interesting ride, even though I know that you and Adlai were a little bit reluctant to take that on, even if Governor Carter had made the offer at the time. So I think what I'd like to do today is just talk a little bit about how I thought to write this book and then what I wanted to do with it in terms of correcting the conventional wisdom about Jimmy Carter, that he was inept president, great former president. That's what anybody on the street will tell you. Everybody feels they know that. That's a piece of received wisdom. And while I do think he was has been an inspiring former president, my overall take is that he's an underrated president and a slightly overrated former president, mostly because when you leave the presidency, and we're about to find this out, and it's going to be a very pleasant experience, you lose all your power. And you can yell and scream as much as you want. And Jimmy Carter did a lot of criticism of his successors, but you don't really have the bully pulpit anymore, and you don't have the levers of government to use to make change and to help, in Carter's case, or hurt, in Donald Trump's case, people's lives. So even though I cover the whole story, and I actually found his life in the Jim Crow South and the way he handled, or in some cases mishandled, that to be in some ways the freshest, newest to me, because I knew the outlines of his presidency. I nonetheless was consistently surprised by how consequential a president he was. And I ended up concluding that he was a political failure. He was swamped by Ronald Reagan in 1980 and didn't pay enough attention to politics, but a substantive and even far-sighted success on the environment and many other issues, as I'll get into. So that was what I concluded. And I started to conclude this when I saw Jimmy Carter at a meeting of my book group in New York City. I live just outside New York in Montclair, New Jersey now, but I'm in this group, and somebody knew Jimmy's grandson, Jason Carter, who's now the head of the Carter Center. He had run for governor of Georgia in 2014. And we were reading this book about Camp David, and he brought his grandfather. And so for an evening, we heard a detailed discussion of Camp David. And afterward, I thought, anybody who could pull off this virtuoso performance, it's the most durable and significant peace treaty since World War II. There must be more to him than failure as president. And then he was also talking that night about his human rights policy, which was hypocritical in several respects. He supported the Shah of Iran for too long. He supported Ferdinand Marcos in Philippines. I could go down the list of areas where the Cold War led him to trim his sails on human rights. But he nonetheless was the first leader in modern history who set a global standard for how governments should treat their own people, and decided that at least part of his foreign policy would be based on which allies and adversaries respected human rights. A number of conservatives who have been critical of his human rights policy at the time, years later, believed that it also had a lot to do with the end of the Cold War, which we can get into. One of the very first things he did as president was to write a letter to Andrei Sakharov and to champion Anatoly Sharansky when he was imprisoned in the former Soviet Union. In any event, just to pick up with that book club, after that evening, I thought, I think I want to look at this for my next book. I had just finished my second Obama book, and I was looking for a new project. And as it turns out, my editor, the late Alice Mayhew, who's one of the great nonfiction editors of the era, she edited Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein on All the President's Men, and Doris Kearns Goodwin and Walter Isaacson and a number of other, Taylor Branch, who won the Pulitzer, number of other writers. And this would be my fourth book with her. First one was on Franklin Roosevelt, who's, I've got a little statue of him right behind me at the tiller. And in case you're wondering, the thing above me is the recruiting poster that my father responded to after Pearl Harbor, and he went downtown Chicago and he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. So in any event, she had edited this book I did on Roosevelt, two about Obama. She was Jimmy Carter's editor. So she loved this idea, in part because there had never been a full biography of Jimmy Carter. So not surprisingly, she smoothed the way, and I got a tremendous amount of access to Jimmy and Rosalind Carter and their entire family. I had met Carter before and interviewed him for Newsweek, but did not really know him. And the access was of great importance. And eventually, Rosalind trusted me enough that she gave me the rather steamy love letters that he sent her from the Navy, that he confessed to Playboy famously that he had lust in his heart, and he certainly did for his wife, Rosalind. They are, I guess, let's put it this way, they're way beyond anything that, John and Abigail Adams would have written to each other. And they were a prelude to Rosalind's role as the most formidable and influential First Lady until that point. And I think you could actually make an argument that because her marriage was so solid, despite some ups and downs that I chronicle, she was even more influential than Hillary Clinton. And unlike Hillary Clinton, whose health care bill failed, Rosalind's mental health bill, the first piece of mental health legislation ever approved by the Congress, passed. But they just had this enormously formidable partnership. She was called the Steel Magnolia. She sat in on cabinet meetings, which was controversial. She was the last person he talked to before he made a decision. She was much savvier politically than he is to this day. When I would talk to the two of them, she has more political horse sense than he does. Really quite tough lady, as I think Nancy can attest, but in a good way. And mostly, in fact, I didn't find anybody who had a critical word to say about her. I could not say the same about her husband, who was much more controversial. So in any event, I kind of launched my research in 2015. I interviewed people essentially in reverse actuarial order, trying to get to people before they died. So I talked to people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, Harold Brown, his defense secretary, both shortly before their deaths, Paul Volcker, who we appointed as chair of the Federal Reserve. And this was a really momentous decision that Carter made, because Volcker, in order to address inflation, jacked up interest rates above 15%. They went as high as 19.5% in an election year in 1980. So people wonder, why was Jimmy Carter defeated? Well, he was running against this great communicator, Ronald Reagan. He hadn't gotten the hostages out. The Iran hostage rescue mission had failed. But arguably, most important, the economy was in really bad shape. And if you're trying to win a presidential election with double-digit interest rates, double-digit inflation, and high single-digit unemployment, it's going to be pretty hard. And so this decision, though, to appoint Volcker, eventually his harsh medicine worked just in time for Reagan to get reelected. So I actually posited to Volcker, in some ways you got Reagan elected and reelected. And he acknowledged that that very well might have been the case, although he says that when he apologized to Carter years after his presidency, when they were on a fishing trip, Carter said correctly that there were many factors in his defeat. In any event, I jumped in, did all this interviewing, interviewed 250 people, was kind of underwater in the papers at the Carter Library in Atlanta. There are literally millions of documents, but I had a sort of an interesting experience that deepened my obsession. You have to be obsessed on a certain level to be a biographer. You have to live with that person, the subject, be essentially married to them for the duration of your research and writing. So, Robert Caro, who asked me not long ago why I wasn't writing 2 volumes, and I said my publisher didn't want 2 volumes. He's been married to Lyndon Johnson for more than 40 years. I feel like I was kind of married to Jimmy Carter for 5 years, but it was easier because what happened was one day when I was at the Carter Library, I got a text from MSNBC to go to a studio and to do coverage, analyze Donald Trump coming down the escalator and announcing that he was going to run for president. So I went over and did that, and I kind of, he attacked Mexicans, rapists. And I kind of felt like I had to take a shower after that. But actually what I had to do was go back to the library, keep working. When I got back to the Carter Library, I found that it was just such a relief, and it was for the next 5 years, a vacation from this orange monster squatting in our brains, So I almost felt like the Carter papers they brushed away the toxins of the Trump presidency, because here was a president who, promised he wouldn't lie, and even though he exaggerated, he didn't lie. He promised he was going to be accountable. He was accountable. He promised he was going to be decent. He was decent, with a core decency that, for all of his flaws, came through. And in that sense, what I'm hoping, and some people who've read it have found that he, reading about Carter and his very novelistic life, is almost a vacation from what we've just experienced, the way it was for me in writing the book, and an inspiration as we move forward to light our way to a better place. So that just helped motivate me, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand his American epic, I guess. So this was a man who is really the only president and arguably only major American figure who effectively lived in 3 centuries. He was born in 1924, but it might as well have been in the 19th century. His family, although far from poor, his father was a prosperous farmer and merchant, running a kind of a feudal system, just one step up from slavery. But they had no running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. Carter was barefoot most of the year. So very much a 19th century life until he was about 11 or 12, and they finally got a windmill out of a Sears Roebuck catalog, and they could pump some water into literally a tin can. You can see this if you go to Plains, Georgia, as I did And you can see it at the national park site. It's like the water is coming out of the holes punctured in a tin can. That was their plumbing at age 11. And then, of course, he was part of all of the great movements of the 20th century, although he ducked the civil rights movement until he was governor of Georgia. And that's an important part of my book. He was living in essentially amid white terrorism in one of the meanest counties in the South. The sheriff there, who was a friend of Carter's, made Bull Connor look like a nice guy. Martin Luther King described him as the meanest man in the world. So Carter is experiencing these major events of the 20th century. He's president in the 20th century. And as far as the women's movement goes, which my father considered to be the most impactful movement of the 20th century, Carter appointed 5 times as many women to the federal bench as all of his predecessors combined, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And he also brought many African Americans into the federal government. Earlier, he had integrated Georgia state government, and he'd had women in senior positions there as well. So he is not just witnessing, but actually advancing these great movements of the 20th century. He's president in the 20th century. He makes peace as a former president in the 20th century. But now, in the 21st century, until last year, he was holding 5 or 6 hours of meetings a day on the Carter Center's agenda, which is disease prevention and eradication, conflict resolution, democracy promotion, the cutting edge issues of the 21st century that he's been intimately involved in. So I just began to see the whole story as almost an American journey. And he never changed his position on race, because from the time he was a boy, he was enlightened on race. His father was a white supremacist. His mother was a nurse who took care of Black patients for free. And he had a third parent, a woman named Rachel Clark, who was a farmhand on his father's property, who signed her name with an X. And she taught him about faith and nature. And he went on to become arguably our greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt. He doubled the size of the national park system. He signed 14 major pieces of environmental legislation, the first funding for green energy. I think people remember that he symbolically put up solar panels on the roof of the White House. The first requirement that toxic contents be labeled, the first toxic waste cleanup, many other pieces of environmental legislation that we can talk about. And if he had been reelected, he would have begun to address climate change, which was happening at the very end of his first term. He was reading in the scientific literature, and as early as 1971, I found him underlining articles about, quote, carbon pollution in the journal Nature. Other presidents like to play golf. Carter played tennis, but he liked reading about science. This was the kind of man he is one of the most, if not the most intelligent men ever to hold the office in an IQ sense. His emotional intelligence, on the other hand, his EQ, was not in the top rank. And I think this hobbled him. He didn't always read people well, and he didn't schmooze well or handle his relations within the Democratic Party well. And in one of my more than a dozen conversations with him, interviews with him, he acknowledged that his failure to manage his relationships within the Democratic Party. That was his biggest mistake as president. And as I think many of you know, Ted Kennedy challenged him when he ran for the Democratic nomination in 1980. And that hurt Carter against Reagan because he didn't have a unified Democratic Party. And they also, because they were like oil and water personally, they couldn't get to agreement on health care. And so it was, another 30 years before Obama was able to get through a bill that was quite similar to what Carter, could have had in the late 1970s if he played his cards a little differently. So we haven't talked about how he was swamped by events in the second 2 years of his presidency. He had completed not just Camp David, but establishing full diplomatic relations with China. This is the foundation of our global economy today, for better or for worse, that bilateral relationship, which didn't exist until Carter. The Panama Canal treaties arguably prevented a war in Central America and were a stunning accomplishment and also a very colorful one that cost 5 U.S. senators their seats in 1978 and 1980, but did a lot to end the Yankee go home quality of our relations in Latin America, and along with the human rights policy, kicked off a democratic revolution in Latin America. So he had these successes, but then he makes what I would argue is maybe his second biggest mistake, besides not getting along well in the Democratic Party. And that is that after the Iranian Revolution in early 1979, and the Shah of Iran flees, and he goes to several countries, and he's in Mexico. And all this time, in the months after he's left, from January until October of 1979, Carter is resisting the pleas of Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski and others that he let the Shah in because he'd been a faithful ally. And at one point, Carter even says, "Fuck the Shah." You wouldn't imagine Jimmy Carter talking that way. Harold Brown told me he was a little surprised when he heard that come out of Carter's mouth, but that was his view, that there was no reason to let him in. However, when the Shah was diagnosed with cancer, an effort was made by the Rockefellers, who were the Shah's main benefactors and who were lobbying heavily for him to be brought in. They essentially pulled the wool over Carter's eyes and convinced him that the Shah could not be treated in Mexico, as if there were no CAT scans or whatever, or chemo in Mexico, which was preposterous. So, but they convinced him of it. State Department convinced him. He let the Shah in, and just days later, the hostages were seized at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. At that time, Carter was way behind Kennedy in the polls, but something, interesting happened that same day. It was November 4th, 1979, exactly 1 year to the day before the 1980 election. So the hostages are seized. That same Sunday, there's an interview on CBS, Roger Mudd interviewing Ted Kennedy. A lot of it's about Chappaquiddick, which reflects very badly on Kennedy. And the highlight of it, or from Kennedy's perspective, the low light, was Mudd asks him, "Why do you want to be president, Senator Kennedy?" Kennedy can't answer the question. So his campaign craters. Carter goes way up in the polls at the end of 1979, but then the hostage crisis drags on and on and on. And then the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and he decides to boycott the Olympics, which is at first really popular, and then, like the grain embargo that he also imposed, unpopular. And so he's riding this roller coaster. During his presidency, Carter went as high as 73% approval rating, 30 points higher than Trump. And he went as low as 26%, which was, that was the summer of the so-called malaise speech, when he didn't use the word malaise, but these long gas lines caused his popularity to plummet. And that was Nixon territory during his resignation, you know. So in those days, we had a much more fluid political situation, and Carter's presidency waxed and waned the whole time, though. And this was what really struck me. He did not allow the politics to determine what the policy was. He thought, and Rosalind did not agree, that if he did the right thing, that the politics would take care of themselves and the American people would recognize that he had done the right thing. And so, you know, arguably he misjudged that, or didn't fully understand that to be a successful president, you have to bring the politics and the policy together. You have to align them properly, which he failed to do. But as I think many of you know, after leaving office, he goes into a bit of a depression, but he ends up establishing the Carter Center. He did not establish Habitat for Humanity. He does a build, or until very recently, he and Rosalind would take part in a build every year. They'd build a house every year. And in 2016, I helped them build a house in Memphis. But the Carter Center is very involved in these other areas that I described earlier. So he, as I mentioned, he revolutionized the vice presidency. He revolutionized the role of the First Lady. And now he has revolutionized the role of the former president. And I think in doing so, and in for all of his faults, reflecting a life of commitment to bettering mankind, with, for all of his occasional, sometimes not so occasional, personal coldness, for all of the layers that are there in his personality, which I found fascinating because of the complexity of this individual. For all of that, as you peel back the layers of Jimmy Carter, you do get down to this bedrock, this core decency that animates his whole life. And so even when he fell short and was silent in the 50s and 60s about civil rights abuses in his own backyard, he was able to make up for it in the second half of his life. And I think in that sense, there are real lessons that his life story offers for us. Say in a post-George Floyd era, he said, he and Rosalind issued a statement not long after that where he said that they had learned in their travels around the world that silence does equal violence. And so I think a lot of what they've done has been generated and powered by their faith, which I deal with, in some detail. Carter actually went as a missionary for the Baptist Church in 1968. They came upon a brothel at one point, and he tried to convert the madam. That's a different story. But so he's powered by his faith, but also by this sense of atonement. I'm going to make up for what I didn't do in the 50s and 60s. And there's a lesson for all of us. If we were too silent about racial injustice, we can make up for it now. If we didn't do enough to help others, we can make up for it. That, to me, is just one of many lessons of Jimmy Carter's rich and fascinating life. I think with that, Nancy, I should stand down. I would love to hear any questions that anybody had.
And we are encouraging people to ask questions. We have some here, but first, This is why that book is so moving, and I do hope that people will take advantage of the fact that they have this lesson, these life lessons to learn from reading Jonathan's book. One of the first questions, Jonathan, is what qualities of leadership did Carter lack, or was he simply a victim of circumstances?
Well, it's a great question that I wrestle with a lot in the book. I think Carter was something highly unusual. He was a visionary without being a genuine natural leader. So, at the Naval Academy, he wasn't a leader there. Stansfield Turner, who became his CIA director, was big man on campus. He would sometimes give you the impression of having a "kick me" sign on his back. He wasn't the kind of guy who, when they go charging up a hill, they look behind them and everybody's charging up right behind them. That's not Jimmy Carter. So he was lacking some intangible quality. It might have been his inability to be a better communicator. He was lacking an intangible quality of leadership. But he was also obviously a huge victim of circumstances that were beyond his control. He had a lot of luck as a presidential candidate and no luck as a president. We haven't talked about his brilliant 1976 campaign where he came from zero in the polls to the presidency. So obviously, as a political leader, when he was campaigning, he could be very effective. But later, he had more trouble conveying leadership, partly because he depumped the White House and he went overboard. I don't think of Jimmy Carter as humble, because I think a humble politician is a contradiction in terms, but he was modest, sometimes showy in his modesty, but that modesty had a way of kind of shrinking him a little bit as a leader. For instance, he didn't want to have "Hail to the Chief" played when he came to the room. He eventually changed his mind on that when Rosalind and Gerald Rafshoon, his aide, urged him to do so. But he also didn't use all of the tools that he could have. So he sold the presidential yacht, the Sequoia. That was a very good tool for getting congressmen to bend to his will. Those powers of the presidency should be used. And so sometimes he left tools on the floor that he might have used for better leadership.
We have a question about the Disabilities Act and Carter's position on disabilities.
That the Americans with Disabilities Act passed under George H.W. Bush, and there's an interesting documentary about Carter's relationship with the disabilities community, and initially he didn't do the right thing, and there were some demonstrations over it. But eventually, his aide, Gene Eidenberg, who's from Chicago and has since died, he was initially the person in the Carter White House who the disabilities community focused a lot of their justifiable anger on. But what Carter did, which is quite rare, is he admitted he was wrong. And then when he saw that this movement had a point, he went with their position on the critical regulation that was involved. So he eventually did not just the right thing, but the important thing for kicking off what I guess about 10 years later became the Americans for Disabilities Act. But there were a number of other things, other movements that he encouraged that we could talk about, even outside of the realm of the environment. So Rosalind Carter, for instance, I mentioned mental health, but she and Claude Pepper joined forces, and they basically ended age discrimination in the federal government, and they went around the country campaigning against mandatory retirement. They felt that older people had something to offer that society wasn't recognizing. And she and Betty Bumpers, who I'm sure you knew, Nancy, they went across the country, Rosalind Carter and Betty Bumpers, and they convinced many state legislatures to require that all initially it was first grade and then kindergarten students be inoculated. That was a matter of state law. They couldn't have a federal law, but it was Rosalind and Betty's leadership that led that. We now take that for granted, and we're gonna see that was all upheld. And this, by the way, this is one of the example of those lesser known achievements that we're gonna find out about soon, because you're going to have people who are going to be barred from getting on an airplane, perhaps, or other going to a concert if they don't have a certificate of vaccination from coronavirus. And people will go, well, I'm going to go to court. I'm going to protest that. Well, the courts have already ruled that children can be barred from school if they haven't been vaccinated for the measles, mumps, and so forth. So that will take place in this coming year. You will see that challenged and upheld using those certificates of vaccination in order to achieve access. And there were failures, you know. Jimmy Carter addressed the Illinois General Assembly on the ERA. Now, some of you might have been watching this new TV series that has somebody playing Phyllis Schlafly, who's also from Illinois, and Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan, that makes the Carter administration not look like they were committed to the ERA. That's really quite unfair to Rosalind Carter, who was very committed to the ERA. Her husband did something I don't think any other president ever had. He also addressed the Florida state legislature. You know, that's not something that presidents did. So there's been a kind of a bum rap that Carter, just because they couldn't get the ERA ratified by the states, that this was his fault. And they actually got the deadline for ratification extended. That was a bill that passed through Congress when he was president. Rosalind wishes that they had pushed even harder on the ERA, but she is also justifiably still angry, or at least bitter, justifiably bitter about the fact that the National Organization for Women not only endorsed Ted Kennedy, a lot of liberal groups did that, but when Carter ran against Reagan, they would not endorse Jimmy Carter for president. Which, when I talk about surprises that I had in doing the book, I was kind of shocked by that. And I think there's a lesson in that also, that we're, you know, now that progressive Democrats are in ascendancy in a lot of ways, that you can't, as Barack Obama said, you can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. I mean, here Jimmy Carter had, as I mentioned, appointed 5 times as many women to the bench as all of his predecessors combined, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and now can't endorse him against Ronald Reagan. There's something really wrong with that. And this is, there's a lesson here. Look, there were so many things that went through in the Carter administration. Trump would never have been impeached without Jimmy Carter, because Carter sponsored and got through Congress the Ethics in Government Act that protected whistleblowers for the first time, the Inspector General's Act that created offices of Inspector General, the FISA courts, the whole thing that we heard about with impeachment. The foundation for all of that was set in the Carter administration, not to mention a reform of the civil service. So now, thank God, we've had these dedicated civil servants who've saved our country in the last 4 years. Well, many of them are what are called senior executive service. These are experienced government employees, public servants, civil servants. And the only reason they're in government is because Jimmy Carter reformed the civil service for the first time in 100 years. So anyway, let's go on. You can tell I could babble on all day about this.
And we could listen all day too. But we have a question here about Carter and his roles with Sadat and Begin, and what his views of Sadat and Begin were. I've just finished that chapter, and people must read this about Carter sitting first in one office of Camp David, one cottage of Camp David, and then running to the other one to work for 13 days, wasn't it, Jonathan?
Yeah.
To persuade them to come together. It was a most astounding chapter. So everybody must read it, but talk a little bit about Begin and Sadat.
So when Sadat first came to Washington and first met Carter, they developed a very intense and very close and warm relationship, and the closest of any that Carter had. And Carter had this irritating habit of calling everybody his friend, like he called Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia his friend. And it wasn't true in any of those other cases. Half the time he'd never met the person before. But by the end of Sadat's life, when he was assassinated in 1981, from 1977 to 1981, he and Jimmy Carter became genuinely close friends. The same cannot be said of Menachem Begin. But having said that, Carter was able to broker this peace. And sometimes he had to be very tough with Sadat. And Sadat threatened to leave a couple of times. Begin threatened to leave a couple of times after Camp David. And this was another thing that really surprised me. The whole deal fell apart, mostly because of Begin, who was urged by some prominent Jewish leaders who were not thinking straight, that Camp David wasn't in the interest of Israel. And so he started to kind of back away. And 6 months after Camp David, in March of 1979, Carter, at great political risk over the objections of all of his advisors, goes to Egypt and Israel, and he puts the whole deal back together with chewing gum and baling wire and masking tape. And then they finally have an agreement, because Camp David originally was an accord, not an agreement. And it wasn't until 1979 that they had the actual treaty. Now, this gets us to a question that some people might be wondering. Carter's attitude toward Israel and the Jews in the years since then. And Carter was never popular with Jewish voters. He didn't have a feel for appealing to Jewish voters. He was the only president who didn't get a majority of Jewish voters in recent history, I think maybe ever in the 20th century. But I argue in the book that whatever Carter's support for the Palestinian cause is, however dumb it was for him to entitle a 2006 book, Palestine, Peace or Apartheid, wasn't a smart thing for him to do, even though Israeli politicians use the apartheid word all the time. Whatever his failings on that, deeds are more important than words. And what Camp David did, even though it did not bring a comprehensive Middle East settlement and a Palestinian autonomy and a Palestinian state, it laid the groundwork for that, but it did not achieve that. That was what he hoped to do in his second term. But what it did do is it took the Egyptian army off the table as a threat to Israel. When I was growing up in Chicago and going to synagogue, I heard, like every American Jew, Israel is in danger of being driven into the sea. That was the formulation. We haven't heard that formulation for the last 40 years, because the only army that could drive Israel into the sea was the Egyptian army. They had tried 4 times between 1948 and 1973. There hasn't been a shot fired in anger since then. So I would argue that Jimmy Carter was the best president for the security of the state of Israel of any president since Harry Truman, who recognized Israel, and despite all of his pro-Palestinian comments over the years.
Can you take one more question, Jonathan?
Sure, I can take, I mean, as long as you want to go.
Well, here's one about the role of the media in the coverage of the failed rescue attempts, especially the Ted Koppel program that headlined America Held Hostage Every Night.
Yeah. So I deal with this at length in the book. I interviewed Ted Koppel about it. This was, it went on for months. This definitely contributed to the hostage crisis, helping sink his presidency. Walter Cronkite would say, that's the way it is. February 6th, 1980, the 300th day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran. It wasn't the 300th, but whatever. So yes, this was terribly damaging, but it wasn't just the media's fault. Carter put himself in a position where he was almost held hostage by the Ayatollah because he decided that it would take precedence over everything else. Now, he ended up getting the hostages out, and he was, even though the Iranians humiliated him by releasing them literally 1 minute after Reagan took the oath, Carter was thrilled because he puts peace first and saving lives first. And and they got out, and Carter negotiated it. But there was some unimaginative policy making in between where he gave the Ayatollah some cards in the way he handled it. And he did allow himself essentially to be held hostage and America to be held hostage. The press in general, though, didn't really give him a fair shake. Jody Powell said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't even get a one-night stand. And he was right, because at the beginning of his presidency, Carter does something very important on his first day. He pardons all draft dodgers and all the guys who've gone to Canada. And this was savaged by Barry Goldwater from the right. And on the left, people said, well, why didn't you pardon deserters? Because there were more black deserters and more white people who went to Canada. So that was emblematic of what happened to him throughout. He'd be attacked from the left, attacked from the right. And the media and the Washington establishment engaged in a lot of anti-Southern bias. And they would pile on. And also Watergate was hugely important in this. So he wouldn't have been president without Watergate. He ran this campaign a little bit like Joe Biden's about healing. I won't lie to you. I'll restore the integrity of the presidency. And if it hadn't been for Watergate, he would not have gone from obscure Georgia peanut farmer, former governor, to the presidency. But then once he gets there, the White House press corps, the Washington press corps, they are all conditioned by Watergate. So Watergate made him and then it unmade him, because they approached everything as a scandal. They put Gate, who was this columnist for the New York Times, William Safire. He wanted to minimize Nixon's crimes. So he put Gate after every stupid little story about the Carter administration. And Carter had a really hard time and never really did get a fair shake from the Washington press corps.
Next. Thank you, Jonathan, for this afternoon with you. We miss you in Chicago, but come back as soon as we can all travel again.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm honored. I revere you and Adlai and your whole family and what they've done for this country. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have spent this time with you. So I hope I'll see everybody soon.